3 villages burned, 14 civilians dead, and one-man President Traore stood barefoot in the dust, holding nothing but a folded map and a name whispered through smoke. Dio. Around him, mothers buried rice under floorboards. Children learned to stay silent when the sky hummed, and foreign boots marched through courtyards that once echoed with music. When the world looked away, a different war began, not for land but for memory. Traore didn't shout. He didn't beg. He asked just one question: who gave them the right to turn our memories into targets? This is a story of power without permission, of silence that shatters, of a people who refuse to let their history be redacted by drones and contracts. And though this story is fictional, the names, places, and events imagined, the pain is real. The questions are real. Because somewhere in some corner of this world, someone is still hiding their children under a stove and wondering why no one speaks for them. Today we speak, and we remember. The story begins with silence, but not the peaceful kind. At exactly 7:42 a.m., Ismail picked up the red crayon. Not blue, not green-red, and instead of the usual sun with a smiling face, he began to draw the sky. But this time the sky wasn't cheerful. It was burning. A jagged shape appeared on the paper, a helicopter, its blades like claws. 4 of them. From each one he scribbled thick arrows pointing downward, labeled in shaky letters. Boom! His small fingers hesitated only once when drawing the stick figure standing beneath the fire. No eyes, no face. Just arms raised to the sky and a small label below it, Papa. The other children in the classroom were coloring trees and goats and rivers. But Ismail remembered last Tuesday, when the air began to hum, when the dirt started to shake, when the wind shifted without warning, and his mother grabbed him so tightly he couldn't breathe. Across the village beyond the cracked school walls, the same mother Salamata was moving like a shadow through their clay-walled home. No shoes, no sound, only instinct. Her baby girl Mariam clutched to her chest. Her older son Naji, still too shocked to speak, followed her with wide, silent eyes. The soldiers hadn't arrived yet, but she heard them. She always did before anyone else. Not Burkina-based soldiers, not even French. These boots were different, too polished, too smooth, and the voices cold clipped like machines trying to speak a language they didn't respect. She pulled back the floor mat beneath the old stove, lifted the loose boards carefully, just wide enough for 3 bodies. She'd been digging that hole for weeks, not because she knew when, but because she knew they would. Down went Mariam, still asleep. Then Naji, pale as chalk, and finally herself lowering into the dark with one arm, the other still cradling her daughter. She pulled the sack of millet over them, wrapped her shawl around their heads, and mouthed a lullaby with no sound. Back at the school, the teacher, Madame Kadi, moved between rows of students. She had been teaching for 13 years, had seen enough sadness to know which children were simply tired and which were carrying secrets no one should hold. Ismail was the second kind. She knelt beside him and asked gently, "Who is this Ismail?" He didn't answer, just pointed. To the helicopters, to the fire, to the faceless man. Then for the first time since Tuesday he spoke. They came from the clouds, and Papa didn't run fast enough. Her breath caught. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She simply stood, took the drawing, folded it 3 times, and slipped it into her satchel between the lesson plans and the attendance book. That afternoon, she removed the envelope's address. No name, no school stamp, no fingerprints. Just a sentence written in red ink across the front for the man who still listens. She sent it off with the market courier heading to Ouagadougou, and she never mentioned it again. Meanwhile, back in the village, the trucks rolled in. No sirens, no warning. Just the low purr of foreign engines cutting through the dry air. The boots hit the dirt. 4 men. No uniforms. No flags. Only one thing in common: they didn't belong. They didn't search for weapons. They searched for signals, phones, radios, satellite pings. They didn't shout. They whispered into headsets. They placed beacons in the corners of walls, beneath pots, inside thatched roofs. They weren't here to fight. They were here to map. But when one of them stepped too close to the stove, when the dust shifted and a tiny cough escaped from under the millet sack, Salamata held her breath so tightly she thought her lungs might tear. The man paused. His boot hovered inches from the plank. Then A voice crackled over his earpiece. He turned. One word in that strange clipped tongue, move. And just like that, they left, leaving behind no blood, no fire, just a single boot print above a hiding place that would not be enough next time. Hours later, Salamata rose from the floor. She kissed her children's foreheads, wiped their faces with her skirt, and walked into the yard, numb, covered in soot. Then she saw it, half buried in the dirt, glinting against the setting sun, a black metal tag. Scratched, scorched, but still legible. Red Dune Solutions, hashtag KH3095. She stared at it, her hands shaking, her lips forming a name she hadn't spoken aloud since the smoke swallowed their home Dio. And far away in a quiet office, a man named President Ibrahim Traore held that folded piece of school paper in his hand. He hadn't opened it yet, but something about the weight of it, the way the edges curled, the faint pressure of crayon pressed by a child's desperate hand, told him this wasn't just a drawing. It was a warning, and someone somewhere had finally decided he needed to see it. We all thought the sky meant rain, until it didn't. The desert was quiet in the way only deserts know how to be, still heavy, humming beneath the silence. Wind whispered across the sand like a warning, unheeded, dragging fine dust along the ridges of abandoned tire tracks that led to nowhere. At the edge of a low escarpment just beyond the perimeter of a dried-up riverbed, two men stood across from one another, one in a faded beret, the other in a jacket too clean for the land he walked on. President Ibrahim Traore did not offer his hand. Major General Kenneth Raleigh didn't expect him to. They hadn't spoken face-to-face in over a year, not since the first reports of unverified operations had begun trickling in from the north villages, flattened wells, poisoned radio towers jammed. Back then, Raleigh had denied involvement. Back then, Traore had still wanted to believe him, but belief is a luxury men like Traore no longer afford. They stood beneath the ghost of a rusted watchtower, its shadow split between them like a fault line. The sky above was bruised with heat, buzzing with a high-pitched nothingness that always preceded bad news. I came alone, Raleigh said first, as if that mattered. Traore didn't move. No such thing as alone in your world, General. Raleigh exhaled slowly, digging the toe of his boot into the cracked earth. Fair. A long pause. Dust slipped between them like static. Then the general reached into his jacket and pulled out a small weathered notebook, its pages thick with sand and sweat. He held it up briefly, then let it drop to the ground between them. I kept copies, he said. Traore didn't look down. What's in it, he asked. Raleigh's jaw tightened. Orders, coordinates, call signs, missions we ran with private contractors, off record, off map, off morality. Still, Traore said nothing. Raleigh shifted his voice low now, carrying the weight of someone who hadn't spoken truth in years. We didn't come for peace, he said. We came for position, forward leverage, strategic corridors, resource zones under the disguise of regional stability. Traore's gaze didn't blink. I know. Raleigh looked up, startled. Then why meet me? Traore replied, voice like sandpaper over stone. To ask one thing. Silence again. The desert listening. Why tell me now? Traore asked finally. Raleigh's throat worked. His shoulders sagged under invisible weight. Because lies, when left alone long enough, become borders, and I helped draw too many of them. He dropped his gaze. Traore's boots hadn't moved, not an inch. The wind picked up slightly, ruffling the edge of Traore's jacket. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out something small, dark and metallic. It clicked softly in his palm as he turned it over. Raleigh recognized it immediately. A contractor tag, burnt at the edges, but the imprint was unmistakable. Red Dune Solutions, KH3095. Traore held it up between two fingers. This was found beneath the floorboards of a widow's home, he said. She dug a hiding place for her children. They came anyway. No shots fired, just boots, data taps, and this, left behind like a calling card. Raleigh's face froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I didn't authorize house raids, he murmured. No, Traore said. You just built the world that allowed them. The wind blew stronger now, stinging their faces. The sky had shifted shades, less blue, more steel. Traore stepped forward once. Just once. Enough to cut the distance by half. You knew what Red Dune was. You knew what they were doing. You just stopped asking why. Raleigh didn't argue. Instead, he bent down, picked up the notebook he had dropped, and offered it again. This time, Traore took it. You want truth, Raleigh said quietly. This is the first step, but it won't save me. It's not for you, Traore answered. It's for the ones still hiding underground who think the sky is the enemy. They stood like that for a moment, two men once allied by protocol, now divided by memory. Traore turned to leave his hand still clutching the tag. Behind him, Raleigh called out one last time, "What will you do with it?" Traore didn't stop walking, but his voice carried back clear as steel. "What you didn't." And the desert swallowed his footsteps as if it too had been waiting for someone to finally say it. No motorcade, no cameras, no bulletproof vest, just a long coat, a dust-stained scarf, and silence. Ibrahim Traore walked through the village of Kubri, not as a president, but as a man searching for something he couldn't yet name. His convoy had stopped 5 kilometers away. No staff had followed. He had told them not to. "I don't need witnesses," he said. "Only memory." The village was more ash than earth now. Roofs sagged inward like tired shoulders. Charred wood and broken radios littered the alleys where laughter once spilled freely from doorways. An old sandal lay in the dirt, small pink, with a single yellow flower stitched into its strap. He paused when he saw it, not because of what it was, but because of where it lay, perfectly upright, untouched by the scorched ground, as if some small foot had vanished mid-step. He did not pick it up. Instead, he moved forward past the remnants of market stalls, past a shattered water drum, past the faint smell of something that had once been cooking before it turned to smoke. Flies buzzed around a broken window. A torn poster of him smiling in an old election campaign fluttered weakly on a pole. He turned his eyes away. Where the school had stood, there was now only cracked cement and a jagged tree stump. The wood was still blackened at the edges, but near its core, pale rings of new growth gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The roots, deep and stubborn, had survived. He crouched beside it, touched the bark, closed his eyes. He could hear them, echoes not of voices but of motion. Chalk scratching blackboards, shoes scraping floors. Children's breaths held when helicopters passed overhead. Not memories he'd lived, but ones he now carried, inherited, imposed. A metal cup lay nearby, half melted. Beside it, a marble. He reached for it, then stopped. Everything in this place had been touched by someone who no longer lived here. And he had not touched enough, not felt enough. For too long, Traore had spoken behind podiums, while others dug graves. He had read briefings while mothers stitched up wounds. He had signed memoranda while villagers buried names no government would ever recognize. And yet now in this silence, he felt everything. The rage, the weight, the absurdity of how foreign boots had pressed the life out of this place without ever needing to pull a trigger. His fingers closed over the edge of the stump, not tightly, just enough to feel the grain. Then he stood. He did not speak. There was no one to hear. But he saw it all. The ghost school, the missing faces, the outlines of hands once pressed to walls now turned to rubble. And something inside him shifted, not loud, not sudden, but deeply and permanently. He didn't plant seeds that day, but something inside him had already begun to grow. The well hadn't worked in 3 years. It coughed up more sand than water, and the rope pulley groaned like an old man with bad knees. Still, every morning at dawn, Salamata came to it with her tin pail and a single hope that something, anything, might rise from the dark. Not water, no. She had long stopped expecting water. What she was drawing up now was discipline, rhythm, something her children could measure the day against. The pail creaked downward, scraping against the stone lining. Her hands, calloused and cracked, worked the rope slowly, deliberately. One child stood beside her, Naji, 9 years old, watching, not speaking. The other, little Mariam, sat on a mat beneath the neem tree, playing with a broken spoon in a ball of hardened clay. Once Salamata had taught 30 children how to read, how to ask questions, how to remember the names of their rivers. That was before the noise in the sky. Before men with names she was never allowed to speak came and called everything insurgent territory. Now she taught her own children something else entirely: how to mix ash with red dirt to make pots that didn't shatter in heat, how to bind palm fibers into cord, How to listen for danger not by sound but by silence. She had not cried for Dio in over a month. Not since the third night when the goats had refused to return to the pen and the air smelled faintly of copper and smoke. That was when she knew. She had waited at the edge of the village road for 2 days with warm food wrapped in cloth just in case. But he did not come. No one said his name aloud, but the elders stopped looking her in the eye, and the neighbor boy brought her Dio's boots without a word. Grief didn't come in floods for Salamata. It came in habits. The way her hands still reached for 2 bowls instead of 1. The way she still placed his scarf by the door every evening as if he might walk in needing it. The way she couldn't quite bring herself to wash the shirt he had left folded beneath their pillow. Grief lived in the marrow of motion, not in screams, but in small, unfinished gestures. Today the well gave her a half pail of murky water, and she nodded without surprise. "It's enough," she said aloud, as much for herself as for the children. Naji followed her back to the courtyard where clay bricks lay, curing in the sun. He carried a rusted metal bowl full of ash and poured it into the mixing pit. Salamata added water, then knelt and began kneading with her hands, slow and methodical. The mixture darkened, thickened, took shape. The boy watched, then mimicked her movements. "You know why we use ash?" she asked without looking up. Naji shook his head. "Because fire teaches us. It breaks, but it also binds." Just like memory. She pressed her thumb into the center of the lump, shaping a hollow. "If you forget too much," she said, "your pot cracks in the first heat." It wasn't just pottery, it was survival. It was history passed down by hand, not book. It was everything Dio had believed in, stitched into dirt and muscle and breath. Salamata didn't know how to fire bullets, but she knew how to make a vessel that could carry rice through 3 dry seasons without splitting. That was her rebellion. Miriam toddled over clay on her cheeks and handed Salamata a crooked bowl she had shaped on her own. It leaned too far to one side but held together. "Perfect," Salamata whispered, brushing the child's forehead with dusty fingers. And there it was, the only kind of victory she still trusted. Not speeches, not flags, just something misshapen and stubborn, made from what others would throw away, that refused to fall apart. As the sun dipped lower, she placed the finished pots in a row, covering them with cloth to keep the moisture. From the roof of her compound, wind carried the distant hum of trucks on the main road, foreign measured, familiar now in the worst way. But she didn't pause. She wiped her hands on her skirt, turned to her son and said, "Tomorrow we build the fire," because she had stopped crying. And now she was building. The night before Dio left was unusually still. The wind had gone quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. The children were already asleep, Naji curled at the foot of the mat. Miriam's tiny hand wrapped around her mother's finger. In the low flicker of the oil lamp, their shadows danced faintly on the mud walls, ghost-like and peaceful, unaware. Dio sat by the doorway with his boots beside him, not yet laced, not yet ready to become the man the uniform demanded. His rifle leaned against the wall, but it hadn't been cleaned. That night he wasn't a soldier. He was a husband with a knot in his chest and too many unspoken truths clinging to the roof of his mouth. Salamata moved quietly behind him, folding his spare shirt, placing it gently in his worn canvas bag. She didn't speak either. Not yet. She had learned that words before departure were heavy things. They either stuck to the soul or haunted the wind. But when she brushed the dirt from his shoulder and smoothed the edge of his collar, he turned and looked at her eyes, darker than usual, like coals that had burned long after the fire was gone. "They're not after land anymore," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "They're after memory." Salamata frowned, pausing mid-fold. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the open door, toward the distant dark where the trucks would come at dawn. "Land they can measure. Land they can own. But memory," he tapped his temple once, "memory's harder to kill, so they dig it out, piece by piece, school by school, song by song." Salamata knelt beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "Then you can't let them," she said. A tired smile crept into the corner of his lips. "You think a man with 1 rifle can stop a ghost army with a map and contracts?" "You're not alone," she said. "No," he replied. "But I won't be there either." He stood then, walked to the far corner of the room and pulled back the reed mat near the stove. Beneath it, in a shallow hole carved weeks ago when no one was watching, he placed a small burlap sack rice wrapped in plastic knotted tight, a single tin of dried okra. 3 matches sealed in wax paper, a folded note blank on the outside, but inside the names of his wife and children. For when food lines get long, he said, or when the wells give up. Salamata didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she asked softly, "What will I tell them if you don't come back?" Dio paused, then crouched in front of her, hands warm on her cheeks. "Don't tell them I died. Tell them I was borrowed by the earth. And when they're older, tell them why we never buried our stories in silence." Outside, a single jackal cried into the night. The lamp flickered once, twice, then stilled. Dio rose again, picked up his boots, and sat on the threshold, lacing them slowly like he had all the time in the world. "You know," he said, "I used to think war was about bullets and flags, but now I know it's about forgetting." Salamata joined him at the doorway. They sat together in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars blink in and out behind thin clouds. No promises, no vows, just breath, just warmth, just the knowing that something sacred was slipping beyond the reach of their hands. At dawn, the trucks arrived, gray, loud, smelling of gasoline and paper orders. He kissed Miriam on the forehead, smoothed Naji's hair, and pressed his lips against Salamata's wrist just once, where her pulse beat fast and defiant. Then he walked into the dust, shoulders, squared eyes straight ahead. He did not look back, and no one saw him again. No body returned, no dog tag, no folded flag, only rumors. Only that whisper passed from woman to woman, widow to widow, that Dio had been seen leading a small group of civilians through the hills, that he had disappeared into the trees during a drone pass, that he had faced a red dune convoy and never backed down. Salamata never confirmed any of it. She never needed to. His last words lived in her hands, in her fire, in the way she still drew circles in the clay before shaping the rim of every pot. Because memory, she had learned, is not buried in graves. It survives in gestures. And she remembered everything. The dust was soft that morning, cooler than usual, still moist from a weak drizzle the night before. Beneath the shade of a half-standing wall, a young girl crouched, stick in hand, dragging lines through the earth with a quiet purpose that made the air around her feel reverent, almost sacred. She was perhaps 7, her dress patched in 3 places, one sandal missing. But her focus was absolute. She was drawing a map. Not one from books, not from borders, someone else had drawn on plastic sheets with flags and pipelines. This one was made from memory, her memory, and maybe someone else's before hers. She sketched a winding river, then a tiny cluster of squares to the left of it, market stalls labeled in her head, but not in ink. She added footpaths, not roads, and trees, not buildings. At the bottom corner, a little circle with dots radiating outward, a drum circle where music used to rise on weekends before it was outlawed for security reasons. Her lips moved silently as she drew whispering directions to herself. Left at the mango grove, right after the 3rd well. If you reach the broken swing, you've gone too far. Salamata saw her from across the courtyard. She had just finished sorting dried cassava, her hands still dusted white. For a moment she didn't approach. She only watched. There was something in the way the child traced each line, not careless, not rushed, but careful, like she was remembering more than drawing. Eventually, Salamata walked over and knelt beside her. "That's not a bad river," she said softly. The girl looked up, eyes wide and curious. "It's the old one, before they moved it." Salamata tilted her head. "Moved it? My uncle says the new maps show it wrong, like it flows through someone else's land now. But it doesn't. It still goes past my auntie's hut. I saw it just last week." Salamata smiled, though there was no joy in it, only a quiet recognition. She pointed to the far end of the drawing where a faint line curled toward the horizon. "And what's this?" the girl replied instantly. "That's where the music goes." "Music? My sister says our land doesn't stop where the fence does. It keeps going where the music goes." The sentence landed in Salamata's chest like an echo of something she'd forgotten, she'd once believed. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Before the fences, before the patrols, before the sky hummed with foreign wings. She didn't correct the girl, didn't tell her that maps didn't work that way. Because really they did. Not the ones drawn in government offices, but the ones people walked with their feet, taught with their stories, and remembered through games scratched into the dirt. "Your sister's smart," Salamata murmured. "She's gone now," the girl said. "But I remember what she said." Salamata reached down and brushed a line of the map with her thumb, smudging it slightly. The girl didn't flinch. "That's okay," she said. "I draw it different every time, but the places always come back." There in the dirt was a truth no gun could erase, a land not defined by ownership, but by remembrance, by rhythm, by footsteps, by play. Salamata stood dusted off her skirt, and for the first time in weeks she whispered a line from an old school chant. "Where the river curves, the people stay." The girl smiled and kept drawing. Private First Class. Adama Kir was 24 the day he became a ghost in his own army. It was the third week of the long dry season, and the air along the border had grown thick with tension and drone hums. He had been posted to Sector 17 Bravo, a dusty crescent of no man's land, supposedly cleared of civilians. Satellite maps said it was empty. Command reports said it was hostile, but neither of them had walked the footpaths between the baobab trees. Adama had. That morning his unit was ordered to secure a ridge routine sweep, they called it, but he'd heard stories. Old women who carried babies under their skirts. A teacher who hadn't spoken since the last airdrop. Rumors, of course, ghosts. Still, he hesitated when the coordinates came in. Something itched in his chest, a pull stronger than protocol, older than orders. They were halfway up the ridge when he saw them. 32 civilians huddled behind the rocks, most of them barefoot, some barely old enough to walk. A grandmother was trying to calm a crying infant with crushed hibiscus petals on her fingers. They weren't hiding well. Not from drones. Not from what was coming. Adama made the choice without thinking. He didn't call it in. He didn't ask permission. He didn't shout. He just turned, dropped his rifle into the dust, raised both arms, and said, "Follow me. Stay low." He led them down a dry wash that wasn't on any map, through tall grass that sliced at his skin, under branches that tore his sleeves. He carried one boy on his back for nearly a mile. He gave his own canteen to a girl who couldn't stop coughing. Behind them, just after they cleared the ridge, came the sharp crack of mortars, late automated program. The sky didn't care who it was killing. It only cared that someone was standing. By the time they reached the abandoned mill outside Banfra, Adama's legs were shaking, his voice gone. He didn't stay, didn't ask for thanks, just turned back toward camp in silence. He expected arrest, demotion, trial, at the very least a reprimand in his file. But none of it came. The incident report gone, the field logs rewritten, surveillance drone footage labeled corrupted file. It was as if nothing had happened, but something had. The next morning, 3 women arrived at the edge of the barracks wall, not close, just near enough to be seen. One of them dropped a woven basket of plantains with a red ribbon tied to the handle. No name, no message. But when Adama looked closer, he saw a thin strip of paper folded beneath the fruit. Some rules were never ours to follow. That week, wherever he went, mothers began whispering his name. Not loudly, not publicly, just softly enough that it stuck to fences and doorways. That's the one who turned, the one who walked back into fire with empty hands. He stopped wearing his insignia, stopped eating in the mess hall. He didn't speak much, and no one pushed him. It was as if his uniform had become transparent, as if the system didn't know what to do with a soldier who didn't break the law but broke the silence. Then 3 days later, the letter arrived. No envelope, no address, just folded into the pages of his field manual, resting between a map of radio towers and a list of approved contractors. On the paper, 7 words handwritten in neat, almost delicate script. "Come at dawn where the earth sings." There was no signature, no seal. But something about the ink, the faint curl at the tail of the S, the pressure of the strokes made him certain someone had been watching. Not just the army, not just command, someone else. Adama folded the paper once more, slid it into his boot, and walked to the edge of camp. The sky above him was turning orange. The horizon whispered, and somewhere not far off, the earth had begun to hum. The chapel stood at the edge of the old mission compound, half swallowed by thornbush and silence. Its windows were shattered, its bell long fallen, its cross snapped in two and leaning against a wall where vines had begun to grow through the stone. No flags flew there anymore. Not national, not military, not even holy. Just cracked walls, dust on the pews, and the smell of long-dead incense clinging faintly to the air. Adama Kir arrived before sunrise as instructed. He wore no uniform, just a plain linen shirt rolled at the sleeves, boots still caked with red dirt. He didn't carry a weapon. Only the folded note in his pocket and a strange kind of calm, as if his body had caught up to something his mind had already accepted. Inside, light filtered through the broken glass, painting fractured patterns on the stone floor. The pews were covered in dust. Mice rustled somewhere beneath the altar. A small bird had built its nest inside a lantern hook near the ceiling. The world, it seemed, had forgotten this place, and that made it holy again. He heard footsteps before he saw the man. President Ibrahim Traore entered quietly, without ceremony, without guards. He too wore civilian clothes, simple, dark, almost monastic. He carried something small in his hand, wrapped in a cloth. No greetings were exchanged. No titles spoken. They sat together in the second pew, side by side, not touching, not even looking at each other at first. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of things unsaid, of roads they both had walked alone. After a moment, Traore unwrapped the cloth and placed a small bronze token on the bench between them. It was roughly shaped, hand-forged, clearly not made by machine. On one side, the faint etching of a seed inside an open palm. On the other, words engraved with simple care, "For those who move because their soul commands it, not their rank." Adama stared at it, didn't speak. His throat tightened, but not from fear. He had never seen this token before, but somehow he knew what it was. "You disobeyed," Traore said quietly. "Not out of anger, not for glory, but because your conscience was louder than your orders." Adama finally turned his gaze to the president. "You were watching." Traore didn't smile. "We all were, but not all of us could act." He nodded toward the token. "Take it or leave it. Either way, it already belongs to you." Adama picked it up, turned it once in his hand, feeling its weight, not just the metal, but the meaning, the validation, the quiet revolt. In the shadows near the old confessional, General Raleigh watched from behind a collapsed wooden screen. He had arrived before them, uninvited but unseen, and had not intended to stay. But when he heard Traore's voice, something held him there. And when he saw Adama take the token, something inside him cracked, not loudly, not violently, but with a soft internal snap that echoed through his bones. He had given orders to men like Adama, had taught them how to follow, how to question nothing, how to become the extension of policy instead of the voice of principle. And yet here was this boy, no medals, no rank worth remembering, being honored for breaking what Raleigh had built. His hand clenched slightly against the wall. His mouth opened as if to speak, but closed again. He wasn't ready. Back at the pew, Traore stood. "This place was once sacred," he said, "until men used it to bless silence." Adama looked around the ruined chapel. "It still is," he replied. They didn't shake hands. There were no signatures, no speeches, only a quiet understanding between two men who had chosen not to be blind. As Traore walked toward the exit, he paused near the confessional, as if he sensed something in the dark. He said nothing, just let his fingers trail along the cracked wood before stepping back into the sunlight. Adama sat a moment longer, the bronze token warm in his palm. And behind the screen, General Raleigh remained frozen in the shadow, a man now surrounded by the ruins of more than stone. The sun had begun its climb, brushing pale gold across the broken stones of the chapel, as Adama Kir stepped out into the morning. He walked slowly, deliberately, his posture upright but unceremonial. In his right hand, clenched tightly, was the bronze token, not pinned to his chest like a medal, but hidden in his palm like a promise. There was no crowd waiting for him, no reporters, no soldiers, no music. Only the rustle of thorn bush, the hum of early insects, and the soft breath of wind moving over dust. Traore stood just beyond the threshold, his arms behind his back, his gaze fixed not on Adama's feet but on the horizon. He didn't smile. The president had long learned that moments like this were too sacred for applause. Adama stopped beside him. For a moment they said nothing. Then quietly Traore spoke. "Don't wear it," he said, nodding toward Adama's fist. "It's not a crown." Adama opened his hand slightly, just enough to let the morning light catch the curve of the token's edge. Traore continued, "Use it as a compass. It doesn't point north, it points inward." Adama said nothing, but he nodded once deeply, as if to anchor the words inside himself. The metal felt warmer now, not just from the sun, but from something else. Something burning gently beneath his ribs. Not pride, not victory, just certainty. Behind them, deep in the darkness of the chapel's crumbled nave, General Raleigh leaned silently against the wall. He had not followed, had not spoken, had not even exhaled until now. But as the boy stepped into light, unarmed, unarmored, unafraid, Raleigh felt something in his chest shift slow and tender, like an old wound remembering its shape. His eyes blurred, not with shame, not even grief, but with something harder to name: recognition. He had once been that young, once walked without maps, once believed in things not written in doctrine. But time had chiseled belief into strategy, and strategy into silence. Now he watched this boy walk forward, not into glory, but into responsibility, and he felt the ache of what it cost to forget what it meant to care. He wiped a tear with the back of his hand. No one saw it, and that made it real. Outside, Traore turned toward Adama and said only one more thing before walking away. When the next fire comes, don't ask who started it. Ask what you're willing to save. Adama watched him disappear into the dust, then looked down once more at the token. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply closed his hand again and began walking, not toward the camp, not toward the barracks, but toward where the silence waited to be broken. And the chapel stood behind them, quiet and roofless, holding no saints, now only stories. The room was underground, cold, windowless, humming with the low static of machines built to record silence. 3 desks formed a triangle around a projection screen. A single bulb hung overhead, flickering slightly with each shift of the generator. It was not a war room, not exactly, but it had begun to feel like one. President Ibrahim Traore stood at the center, his sleeves rolled up, the knot in his tie loosened. Around him, 2 members of his private intelligence team hovered silently. One tapped at a keyboard adjusting filters. The other held a thick sheet of laminated parchment beneath the glow of an ultraviolet lamp. On the table before them, a map. At first glance, it was nothing unusual. It looked like a humanitarian field layout, the kind used by NGOs to coordinate refugee services, vaccinations, mobile clinics. There were Blue Cross symbols, green corridor arrows, small tent icons along rivers. But under UV light, another layer appeared, and it bled. Lines that were once curved and welcoming became hard-edged grids. The blue crosses flickered into red X's. The green corridors turned black. Each health station revealed itself as a coded forward operating base. Each supply route was in fact a logistics lane for armored convoys, and some of the villages labeled stabilized had long since ceased to exist, buried, erased, or quietly resettled in official files. Traore leaned in, eyes narrowing. He traced a faint circle with his finger. This was the maternity tent near Jibo, he said. I visited it last year, gave a speech. One of the analysts nodded grimly. The tent was real, but 50 meters behind it was a drone control station, hidden inside a water purification unit. The real perimeter never made it to the public maps. Traore's jaw clenched. He moved down the page toward the southern border, a long humanitarian corridor stretching from Bobo Dioulasso to Gawa glowed pale green under normal light. But beneath UV, it lit up in thin crimson veins, lined with coordinates and numeric tags. Red Dune Sector Access, 12A. Clearance Tier, 4. Private Extraction Corridor, Agro-Minerals Leconotide. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, it was not loud, but it was final. This is not protection, he said. It is possession. The words sat in the air like lead. He took a deep breath, then pulled a small folded map from his own coat pocket, the same one Ismail's teacher had sent weeks ago, the one with red crayons and helicopters and a faceless man. He placed it beside the glowing UV map. 2 cartographies, 2 visions, one drawn by a frightened child, the other by a strategist with unlimited ink and no shame. And yet only one felt like the truth. This, Traore said, tapping Ismail's map, was drawn with fear, but at least it was honest. He stepped back, rubbing his temples. How long, he asked. How long have they been building this world inside ours? One analyst replied without looking up. Years, maybe longer. The layering only works if it's gradual, slow enough that even the watchers forget they're watching. Traore turned toward the screen where coordinates still glowed like veins across the land. Veins not feeding the country, but draining it. Who gave them the right, he murmured. No one answered, because they already knew. No one had. But no one had stopped them either. The president stood in silence for a long time. Then he walked over to the far wall and switched off the UV lamp. The room went dim again. The lines vanished. The deception sank back into the page like ink into cloth. But Traore still saw it. He would always see it now. Not the map itself, but what it meant: a country redrawn without permission. Not with borders, but with contracts. Not with soldiers, but with plausible deniability. And as he left the room, his voice was barely above a whisper. Maps don't lie, but the hands that draw them do. The grand hall of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa shimmered with ceremonial formality. Polished marble reflected the stiff elegance of tailored suits, gold pins, and national flags arranged in neat rows like loyal soldiers. Delegates sat behind plaques bearing their country names in 3 languages. The air smelled of diplomatic coffee and restrained ambition. At the far end of the circular hall, the podium awaited. President Ibrahim Traore stepped forward, not flanked by aides, not draped in military trim, but carrying something strange in his arms: a folded cloth, hand-painted edges, frayed colors faded but vibrant in places where the brush had gone back again and again. Whispers began immediately. Was this a gift, a prop, an act of desperation? He did not explain. Not at first. He unfolded the cloth on the stage floor. It was a map, but not one any of them had ever seen. No borders, no national lines, no demarcation of disputed zones. Instead, rivers, trade routes, pastoral migration paths, language arcs, drum rhythms, and ancient foot trails. Cities were not circles, but woven knots where patterns converged. Mountains appeared not as walls, but as spine-like ridges holding regions upright. He let the room absorb it. Then he looked up, his voice clear, but without flourish. We have spent decades debating where lines should be redrawn. But what if the lines never belonged at all? The room stilled. Traore stepped beside the cloth, tapping gently near the bend of a river. This is the Niger. Here, 2 villages on either side of the water share language, grain, and marriage. But a colonial treaty calls one of them foreign and the other national. Why? He pointed to another junction, a cluster of small dots surrounded by concentric rings. Here, 3 communities meet every year for a market older than your oldest ministries. Yet their trucks are stopped, their goods taxed, their names mispronounced. He paused. The map you've been using doesn't show these things. It shows pipelines. It shows minerals. It shows buffer zones and blast radii. But it does not show people. It does not show song or story or kinship. It was never drawn to include us. A diplomat from the Western Bloc shifted in his seat. Another reached for a glass of water. But Traore did not wait for applause. He wasn't here to be heard. He was here to reclaim space. Colonial lines created artificial scarcity, he said, voice rising. Now the cloth still open at his feet. But our richness was always in connection. Our wealth, our security was never in fragmentation. It was in flow. When rivers became borders, we damned ourselves. When dialects became threats, we silenced ourselves. When trade paths were named zones of instability, we forgot that they had once been arteries of peace. He walked once around the map, slow and deliberate. No child in Burkina Faso ever said, I am born on the 11th parallel. He said, I live where the soil breathes when it rains. No elder in Mali ever claimed a satellite border. She said, my auntie lives where the drum travels before the echo fades. A few murmurs now, someone scribbling in a notebook. A translator paused, then resumed with caution. We do not need permission to remember what we were before the lines. We only need courage to recognize each other beyond them. This map is not a rejection of statehood. It is a reminder that sovereignty begins with truth, and the truth is we were always bigger than our borders. He stood still, hands at his sides. His eyes swept the room. No defiance, no pleading. Only conviction. Let this be our starting point, he said. Not for redrawing, but for listening. Silence, but not empty silence. A few heads nodded. A hand tapped gently on wood. A breath held a second longer than usual. He stepped back from the podium, folded the cloth again, carefully, respectfully, and placed it on the table marked Burkina Faso. He had brought no slides, no projections, no economic forecasts. Only a memory stitched painted and undeniable. And across the room in one diplomat's lap, a standard-issue map curled slightly at the edge, almost ashamed. The applause came late and uneven. A few delegates clapped instinctively, more out of protocol than passion. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a statement or a challenge. Some leaned into quiet conversations, words hidden behind flicks of the wrist and lowered eyelids. But there were also those who leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes wide, not with skepticism, but with recognition. In their faces something softened, not defeat, but memory awakened. A delegate from Senegal rose first. She did not speak, just placed her palm flat on her nameplate and bowed slightly in Traore's direction, then sat down. From the Ethiopian side, someone murmured, "He's not wrong." Another from Kenya, "It's an old truth," but said new. And then, almost too softly to catch, came a whisper from the Ugandan row, an older man veteran of 3 cabinets who had once signed trade deals under 5 different map sets. "This is bigger than politics." The phrase hovered in the air like a scent, unclaimed, undeniable. Traore stood still at his seat. He did not ask for more applause. He didn't gesture to the cloth map now folded beside him, resting like an heirloom returned home. Instead, he leaned slightly forward enough to make his words land closer, more intimate. He smiled, not smug, not triumphant, but with the weariness of someone who has been carrying something fragile for too long and has finally carefully placed it down. "It's not my map," he said. A pause. "It belongs to every child who never knew what a border was until someone made them bleed for crossing it." The room was silent again. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of listening. That rare electric kind of quiet that follows a truth spoken too clearly to argue with and too gently to feel like a threat. The kind that reaches past policy and protocol and presses its palm against the ribs of every person present. Traore's fingers traced the edge of the cloth once more. "We were always told that modern nations need maps to function. But perhaps our nations first need to remember what they function for." No one interrupted. Even those who disagreed remained seated, dignified in their discomfort, because something about the moment made dissent feel too loud even for them. In the back row, a young delegate from a small, landlocked nation clutched her pen tighter than usual. Her father had died crossing a checkpoint that should never have been there. She looked at the cloth map now, thinking not of diplomacy, but of the old lullaby her grandmother sang, one that mentioned a river no textbook ever marked. From somewhere in the left wing, someone cleared their throat. Then nothing. No vote was taken, no treaty drafted, but a shift had occurred not on paper but in posture, in how people looked at each other when names of places were spoken, in how they thought about rivers and roads and songs. Traore sat back, his voice gone quiet now. "The future doesn't begin at a podium," he said. "It begins the moment we stop pretending the past didn't happen." And as the session closed, no one stood. No one clapped again, but no one left early either, because something in the room had changed. Not louder, just truer. The office had been stripped bare. The flags were gone, the plaques removed. Even the thick velvet drapes that once muffled outside noise had been taken down. All that remained was the desk, too large now in the emptiness, and a chair where General Raleigh sat, no longer in uniform, no longer surrounded by aides, just a man with sunken eyes and a silence he had carried for too long. Across from him stood President Ibrahim Traore, holding in his hand a small bent object, a military ID tag, dirt still clinging to its edge, the lettering partially scraped but legible. Red Dune OPs. Tier 4. Clearance Raleigh. He placed it on the desk with deliberate care. "Why were they wearing your name?" Traore asked. Raleigh looked at the tag but said nothing. Traore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They weren't national, they weren't registered, but they entered our villages with drones. They stood over our teachers, they documented our children, and they walked away with your name printed on their access codes. Raleigh finally exhaled. "They're not my men." "No," Traore replied. "But they entered with your silence." The words hung heavier than accusation. It wasn't just blame, it was exposure, an incision. Raleigh leaned back, hands folding over themselves, thumb brushing the place where his insignia had once rested. I never gave them orders, he muttered. But you gave them space, Traore said, stepping closer. You opened the corridor. You stamped the clearance. And then you said nothing when the market turned into an extraction zone. You watched a health station become a weapons cache. And you said nothing. The older man's face trembled, not with fear, but with something far older, erosion. Not a crack, but a slow undoing. I believed it would end differently, he said at last. That they would leave when the job was done. What job, Traore asked. They weren't building roads. They were cutting off memory. What job were they hired to finish? Raleigh didn't answer. Instead, he reached slowly into the drawer beside him and pulled out a black folder, thin unmarked. He slid it across the desk. Inside, a series of signed authorizations stamped in triplicate. Not his alone, but his name appeared enough times to make silence impossible now. I thought I was choosing the lesser danger, Raleigh said. Let them monitor. Let them build a presence. Better them than chaos. Traore picked up one of the pages and scanned it. Technical language, civilian stabilization, integrated support, 1,000 ways to say nothing and still take everything. We called it security, Raleigh said quietly, but it was suppression. There it was, not shouted, but surrendered. Traore closed the folder. You spent your life trying to make the country obedient, he said, but maybe what we needed were men willing to disobey. Raleigh looked up. Like that boy, Adamo. Traore nodded. He understood what you forgot, rank is not righteousness. They stood in silence for a long moment. Outside the window, a small protest had begun to gather, not angry, not violent, just quiet voices chanting the names of villages that no longer appeared on maps. A woman held up a cooking pot as a drum. A child wore a cardboard sign, "My name is not a zone." Raleigh didn't ask what would happen to him. He already knew. He had not been imprisoned, but he had been removed, stripped not of dignity but of the protection that silence had once afforded him. Traore picked up the ID tag, held it one last time, then placed it in the drawer beside the folder. He did not slam it shut. He just whispered, "You were never the villain, but you stopped asking the right questions." And then he turned to leave. Behind him, Raleigh remained seated, not broken, but hollow. Because there are wounds that don't bleed until the war is already over. The room wasn't made for silence, but it was full of it. Cameras clicked. Screens blinked. Translators leaned forward, headsets primed. Microphones bore the crests of major networks, BBC Al Jazeera, NHK France 24. Rows of journalists sat shoulder to shoulder in a heat that felt both physical and political. At the podium stood President Ibrahim Traore. Beside him, to the astonishment of every lens in the room, stood General Raleigh. No uniform, no medals. Just a dark suit, modest and sharp, the collar unadorned his figure, thinner than remembered, but his presence unmistakable. Traore spoke first, brief, calm. This is not a confession, it is a correction. Then he stepped back. The attention turned to Raleigh. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Only scanned the crowd, rows of expectation, rows of judgment, some already drafting the headlines in their heads. He cleared his throat. There were raids you never saw, he said. Operations not listed in any peacekeeping mandate. Contractors who landed before diplomats. Corporations who bid on land while families were still fleeing airstrikes. Gasps rippled. Pens moved faster. Eyes darted. We told the world we were stabilizing the region, he continued. But behind the press releases and the memoranda, there were signatures, mine included, that greenlit extraction, not protection. He placed a thin folder on the podium. The top page bore a single phrase, Red Dune Procurement Agreement. Tier 3 Operational Access. Underneath a stack of documents, declassified, time-stamped, undeniable. Security corridors were weaponized. Food drops used as bait for relocation. Entire neighborhoods mapped for lithium while their wells were poisoned and declared unsafe. We didn't stop chaos, Raleigh said, his voice level almost surgical. We shaped it. The silence fractured then. A question shot from the middle row general. Are you saying this was deliberate? Raleigh didn't flinch. I'm saying we knew. We always knew. But it was easier to call it strategy. Another voice sharper. Why now? Why speak now? He looked sideways at Traore, not for approval, but for context. Because silence is a kind of architecture. It builds walls slowly until even the builders forget there was once an open field. He continued, "This isn't about blame. It's about consequence. When you name a school a data consolidation site, you teach children they are only worth counting. When you turn borders into licenses, you tell a people their history needs clearance. And when men like me allow it because it's legal or efficient or quiet, we don't protect peace. We sterilize resistance." A woman in the front row whispered, "Is he admitting to treason?" Traore stepped forward again, not to defend, but to anchor. "This isn't treason," he said. "This is truth that no longer fits into silence." He gestured to the folder. "The world won't change because someone shouted. It might, however, shift when someone finally names the weight we've all been carrying." Reporters shouted questions now about prosecution, about policy, about reparations. None were answered, not yet, because some truths are not resolved in the moment they're detonated, and the world takes time to feel the shock. As the conference ended, Raleigh stepped down from the platform and walked past the flashing lights, past the buzz of analysis and breaking news. A child watching from a screen in a schoolroom far from the Capitol turned to her teacher and asked, "Why did the man look so sad?" The teacher smiled, tired, because sometimes the bravest thing isn't saying no, it's saying yes. Too late. The address was not broadcast from the presidential palace. It came from a single wooden podium set beneath a neem tree in Cabri, where a school once stood and where nothing remained now but flattened earth and scattered chalk. The cameras were few, the lighting was dusk, and yet across the country millions tuned in, on rooftops, in market stalls, around radios with frayed wires and televisions running on backup batteries. In cities and in displaced camps, people gathered not for spectacle but for something more rare. A reckoning. President Ibrahim Traore stood alone, no advisors flanking him, no army behind him, only the gentle evening wind and a small candle flickering on the edge of the podium. The candle had been lit an hour earlier by a teacher from the local district. It had once sat on the desk of a boy named Ismail, who no longer attended school because there was no school left to attend. Traore began without preamble. "This is not a moment for vengeance," he said. "This is a moment for memory." His voice was steady, not rising for drama, just honest. "We have been told that to forgive is to forget, but they are not the same. We do not forgive what has not been named, and we will not forget what we never deserved." He paused, letting the wind shift the hem of his coat. The candle danced but did not die. "There are those who will say we are dividing the world by speaking truths it cannot hold. Let them speak. There are those who will say we are too proud, too loud, too late. But I say this dignity is not shame. To stand on broken ground and declare, we are still here, that is not rebellion. That is survival with intention." The wind softened. The light from the candle stretched its glow across the wood grain of the podium. "We won't defend our skies with missiles," Traore continued. "We will defend them with memory, with names spoken aloud, with maps that show where music travels, with stories that outlive the men who tried to silence them. We won't build monuments to pain, but we will make sure the world cannot walk over our dead without knowing who they were." He glanced briefly at the candle, its flame steady now, as if listening. "Tonight in every region I ask you to light one like this. Not for me, not for politics, but for every child who asked why helicopters roar louder than lullabies, for every widow who buried her husband in silence, for every teacher who taught under threat but still wrote freedom in chalk. This is not the end of fear, but it is the end of pretending fear is all we have. We will write with ash if we must. We will rebuild with clay if that's what's left. But we will call this land ours. Not because we bought it, but because we remember it." His voice softened now, nearly breaking. "To the world watching, we are not victims. We are the ones who stayed. And when the last gun leaves, we will still be here, growing morning singing." Traore stepped back. He didn't blow out the candle. He let it burn. And across the country, flames began to appear in courtyards and doorways, on old bricks and cupped palms. No fireworks, no slogans, just light. Because some nations rise not in thunder, but in truth whispered through fire. The land where her house once stood had hardened with fire. Now it bloomed, not with roses nor grain, nor anything soft, but with purpose. Salamata stood beneath a hand-woven shade structure, watching as a line of girls ages 9 to 17 wrapped bandages around each other's arms. Their hands moved with careful precision, fingers steady, brows furrowed not in fear but focus. To the left, others pounded clay beside an old well, mixing ash with water in the same rhythm their mothers used to knead dough. Further back, a third group practiced basic self-defense. Nothing militant, just balanced breath stance. Again, Salamata called gently. Not with force, with memory. Your body remembers more than you think. The girls nodded. Behind them on a cloth pinned to the wall was a painted phrase in 3 languages. These hands can carry, these hands can cook, these hands can heal, these hands can defend. She didn't invent it. It came from her grandmother. A woman who had once delivered babies in a war zone with torn rags and whispered songs. Now Salamata passed it forward. There were no ranks here, no flags. But there was structure, respect earned through kindness, leadership, rotated weekly discipline, taught through honor, not humiliation. A girl named Isatu, barely 10, raised her hand mid-session. Miss Salamata, she asked, why do we learn to fight if we don't have weapons? Salamata walked over and knelt beside her, meeting her eyes. Because someday, she said, a man will point a gun and say you are small, but you will stand tall because you know what to do with your hands. She took the child's palms and opened them. These aren't made for war, but they are not made for surrender either. Later, as dusk approached and the girls sat in a loose circle eating rice with dried mango, Salamata looked around and smiled, not out of pride but recognition. This was the garden she had always imagined. Not one of fruit or flowers, but of fire that learned how to feed instead of destroy. No one gave her permission to start this. No grant, no government contract, no foreign ribbon cutting. She had used burned bricks from her old home, clay from the old riverbank, leftover roofing from the abandoned barracks, and memory, always memory. She didn't speak of her husband anymore, not because she forgot, but because everything she built now carried his name without needing to say it. When the girls packed up to go home, she handed each one a small token, a pebble, a piece of dyed cloth, a bit of dried root. Nothing of monetary value, but everything of meaning. Carry this, she said, not for luck, but to remember what you're already made of. And when the last girl left and the sun curled behind the distant hills, Salamata remained by the well, washing her hands in the basin they had carved from ash and clay. She looked down at her palms, still healing, still warm, still ready. Because some revolutions don't roar, they rise quiet, steady, and made by hand. He arrived without sirens. No media vans, no motorcade. Just a single jeep, dust-covered, pausing at the edge of the courtyard, as if unsure whether this ground would welcome wheels shaped by power. But it did, because the moment President Traore stepped out, the children, dozens of them in head wraps, clay-smudged tunics, and laughter louder than any anthem, cheered. Uncle Captain. The name came from the smallest girl. The others followed. He smiled, surprised, almost embarrassed. A title like Uncle carried a weight no rank ever had. He didn't speak at first, just walked slowly through the garden-turned training center, watching the girls weave cloth-patched satchels, practice one-armed lifts for the wounded. A tiny hand tugged at his jacket. A girl no older than 5 held up a doll with a bandaged arm. She's not broken, the girl said proudly. Just healing. Traore knelt. What's her name, General Mama? The girl whispered. She never loses. He chuckled, not the staged laugh of a leader, but the kind that forgets its owner's title. Salamata approached from the well, hands, dusty scarf tucked firm around her shoulders. They didn't exchange greetings. They didn't need to. Some understandings live beneath the skin. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a plain brown envelope. For water, he said, and shoes. She opened it briefly. No signature, no letterhead. Just what was needed, nothing more. She nodded. They don't ask for much, just to keep building. Traore looked at the girls again. One had begun singing softly while wrapping another's ankle in clean linen. Another played with a rusted compass as if it pointed not north, but home. He turned to leave. Before stepping into the jeep, he glanced once more at the sign above the courtyard gate. Someone had written in charcoal, We grow with clay, we fight with care, and beneath it in a child's handwriting, Uncle Captain came today. He didn't talk like a king, just like one of us. He didn't take a photo, didn't record a speech, but he carried something away quietly inside. Because sometimes a nation doesn't need a president, it needs an uncle. The wall wasn't part of the original plan. It had started as a simple patch of mud brick meant to support the new roof of the learning shelter. But one afternoon when the sun was low and the clay still soft, one of the girls pressed her finger into it and wrote a name. Then another joined, then another. Now the wall stood half a meter tall, but a lifetime wide, covered in names, not carved, not painted, just traced into wet earth by the hands of the living, honoring the gone. Dio's name was near the center, still dark, recently pressed. Not large, not adorned. Just there, holding space. Salamata stood beside it, a rag in one hand, her other brushing lightly across the letters. He used to say they'd come again, she said softly. He thought they'd wear boots, raise flags, speak foreign tongues. She paused. He didn't know they'd come as silence, as money, as development deals. Traore didn't speak at first. His eyes scanned the wall, settling not on any one name, but the way they all leaned into each other, letters slanting like people huddling in memory. Finally he said, "But they met you instead." Salamata turned to him. There were no tears. Not anymore. Only truth. He placed a hand against the wall over no name in particular, just to feel the warmth still rising from the earth. And for a moment they both stood there, not as symbols, not as roles, but as two people who knew the same truth. Some names are never lost. They're only waiting to be written. In the village of Kuruma, at the foot of the hill where ash once fell like rain, a group of children now gather in a sunlit square. They wear mismatched uniforms, hold handmade instruments, and stand before a crowd of elders and farmers, mothers and teachers, survivors and daughters of silence. They begin to sing not a national anthem, but a new hymn written by the village itself. We are the hands that built from ash. We are the children rising yet. We are the names you tried to silence. But we are louder still without regret. Their voices are not polished, but they are full of breath, of memory, of defiance. The crowd doesn't cheer. They don't clap. They rise, heads bowed, eyes open, not in celebration, but in reverence. The camera pans wide, no flags wave, but the wind carries the song across the plain. And somewhere a mother wipes her hands on her apron and whispers, "They remember." That's enough. Raleigh now lives in the southern drylands, far from parliament and microphones. He works alongside villagers building irrigation ditches, barehanded, sunburned, silent. Gone are his medals. Now he wears cement-caked boots and a wide-brim hat. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. He doesn't offer lectures. He digs. He listens. One day, as children pass by singing the new anthem from Kuruma, he pauses. A girl no older than 7 walks up to him with a plastic cup of water. She doesn't flinch, doesn't know his name, just hands it over and smiles. He nods, drinks, then softly, almost unknowingly, hums the anthem's melody under his breath. It's not redemption, but it is recognition. Not a man erased, a man rewoven into the very land he once failed. Traore is no longer president. His face has left the newspapers. His voice, now hoarse, doesn't echo through chambers, but through conversations beneath trees. He returns to the village where the school once stood. The mango tree, once a stump, now casts a wide, full shade. Children play nearby, laughter soft like rain on tin. A girl, perhaps 5, tugs on his sleeve. "Did you plant this tree?" He kneels. "No," he replies with a smile. "You did every time you stayed." He doesn't stay long. No camera follows. Before leaving, he rests his hand on the trunk. The tree is strong, rooted, growing. It would outlive them all, and under its branches, memory stood tall. Some stories shout. This one whispers yet lingers long after. The anthem of the unforgotten isn't just a narrative of injustice and survival. It is a quiet uprising of memory, dignity, and the everyday courage we often overlook. Through Ismail's drawings, Salamata's hands, Traore's restraint, and even Raleigh's reckoning, we're reminded that nations aren't only built with policies and armies, but with choices made in silence, in kitchens, in schools, in mud. The most powerful resistance in this story isn't force, it's presence. The presence of a mother who keeps teaching, a child who keeps drawing, A leader who doesn't speak to be heard but to witness. There are no superheroes here. Only ordinary people who refuse to disappear. And that's what makes this story unforgettable. It tells us that healing doesn't erase the past, it honors it. That dignity doesn't come from erasing our pain, but from refusing to be reduced by it. That sometimes justice doesn't roar, it rebuilds brick by brick, hand by hand, note by note, memory by memory. In a world where news cycles spin fast and trauma often becomes content, this story slows us down. It makes us listen, not to spectacle, but to substance. It asks us not just what happened, but what kind of world allows it to keep happening, and more importantly, what kind of people do we choose to be in response? Because at its heart, this isn't a story about borders, armies, or even politics. It's about inheritance, not of land, but of responsibility, of truth, of care. And perhaps more than anything, it's a call to remember, because forgetting has always been the most convenient weapon. So as the final line falls, under the mango tree memory stood tall, we're left not with an ending, but an opening, a space to ask ourselves what stories live inside us that are still waiting to be remembered and passed on. We'd love to hear yours. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.